I dreamed about the fire at night, and I would dream that it was falling out of the window, screaming. I remember hollering to my mother in the dark, "Mama, I just jumped out of the window." It was a lovely Saturday afternoon in New York City on March 25th, 1911. At the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, the workers were getting ready to go home for the day. Suddenly, cries of fire rang out from the 8th floor. Panic erupted within the factory and workers tried to flee. However, many could not escape because of the locked doors and blocked exits, so that the workers had to jump from the 9th floor windows. In total, 146 people died, 131 women, and 15 men. This tragic event, known as the Triangle Fire, had lasting reverberations. The immediate reaction to the fire and to the tremendous loss of life was horror and shock. Additionally, the acquittal of the Triangle owners of any culpability in the fire galvanized reforms in safety laws and labor rights, which led to revolutionary changes in the American workplace.
During the progressive movement of the early 1900s, activists including the Women's Trade Union League and the American Federation of Labor recognized that the increasing industrial growth was creating poor and unsafe working conditions. In the garment industry, 60% of shops used artificial light in the daytime that provided no protection from the glare and damaged workers' eyesight. 28% of the dirtiest shops were found in the garment trade, and 30% of the bathrooms were in filthy condition with little to no light or ventilation. Factories had overcrowded work areas, 12 to 14-hour shifts, and constant nervous strain from the pressure of overseers and the fast-paced machines. Leonora O'Reilly, an Irish immigrant, explained, "From 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, I am a servant of George E. Bellamy, for which I receive enough money to pay my dues and not a cent for a rainy day." Most of the garment industry was concentrated in New York. In Lower Manhattan, the Ash Building held several factories, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, which produced the latest fashion, the shirtwaist. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, made millions of dollars producing these, and were actually known as the Shirtwaist Kings. They mass-produced garments with scant regard for their employees' labor conditions. They also locked one of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory doors because they thought their workers were stealing cloth in their bags.
Really, in the eyes of many people who held weight within this country, were not people. They were workers. They were chattel. They were responsible for creating output.
When 150 Triangle factory workers protested these conditions by joining the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, they were locked out of the building. Harris and Blank hired security to attack and arrest them. In response, 20,000 workers walked out of every shirtwaist factory in the city on November 22, 1909. On November 25, 1910, a fire broke out at a factory in Newark, New Jersey, where 25 female workers died. The New York City fire chief warned, "This city may have a fire as deadly as the one in Newark at any time. There are buildings in New York where the danger is every bit as great as the building destroyed in Newark. A fire in the daytime would be accompanied by a terrible loss of life." And then, on March 25, 1911, at approximately 4:45 p.m., Triangle factory employees suddenly smelled smoke. A fire quickly spread through the floors of the building. However, when the workers attempted to escape, they found that the exits had been locked. Once those inside realized there was no way out, they panicked. Some people jumped down the elevator shaft and were crushed to death, while others jumped over 80 feet from the windows. One reporter, William G. Shepard, described the chaos. "I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk." The next day, a makeshift morgue was built along the East River. Family members of the deceased victims looked at rows upon rows of coffins in hopes of identifying their loved ones, but many had been burned beyond recognition. The aftermath was a wake-up call to many female factory workers and laborers who reacted furiously to the sheer horror of the day, including Rose Schneiderman, an important member of the Women's Trade Union League. Rose delivered a powerful and resonating speech on April 2, 1911, entitled, "I Have Found You Wanting." She said, "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every year, thousands of us are maimed." She concluded, "The only way they can save themselves is by a strong, working-class movement."
A few weeks after the fire, the Shirtwaist Kings, Harris and Blank, were arrested on the charge that they had intentionally locked the door to the Washington Place stairway. One of the highlights of the trial was the testimony of Kate Altman, a crucial witness for the prosecution. While she was giving her testimony, the defense attorney suggested the speech sounded too rehearsed. He then alleged she had fabricated her story. The jury dismissed all charges against the Shirtwaist Kings in fewer than 5 hours.
Fire was a tragedy. It grabbed public attention. It grabbed headlines. It definitely had an impact, and it resulted in the loss of a tragic amount of human life. But when you have a judge and a jury and respected people and entities who essentially represent the U.S. government and people of import within the United States, when you have those kind of individuals condone what had happened by letting the factory owners off the hook, I think that really created a lot of public outrage and outcry.
As a result of the Triangle Fire, the New York State Legislature established the Factory Investigating Commission. Al Smith, a member of the State Assembly who eventually became the governor, was instrumental in establishing it. Frances Perkins, who herself had witnessed the fire and was the lead investigator of the commission, remembered him saying, "Don't get started asking the governor to appoint a commission. If the legislature does it, the legislature will be proud of it. The legislature will listen to their report, and the legislature will do something about it." Frances Perkins said, "Well, I thought that was absurd at the time, but I learned by long experience that it is not absurd. It's the way to do it. This is the way that the legislatures are persuaded to act." And within 3 years, 36 new state safety laws, called the Triangle Fire legislation, were passed. The members of the Factory Investigating Commission became the leaders of national labor recovery when, in the midst of the Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933 and signed the National Industrial Recovery Act as a part of the New Deal. The act was undermined by Supreme Court decisions such as Schechter Poultry v. United States in 1935. So in 1935, Roosevelt signed the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, and established the National Labor Relations Board to hear cases involving unfair labor practices. Roosevelt also appointed Frances Perkins, over the objections of his advisors, to be U.S. Secretary of Labor. The NLRA marked both the height of collective bargaining reform as well as the beginning of its decline. For example, the Supreme Court ruling NLRB v. McKay Radio and Telegraph Co. in 1938 diminished the right of employees to strike, even though the NLRA stated that the law should protect the individual as the weaker party, and that the best protection against the individual weakness was collective action. Gradually, the NLRA's protections have begun to unravel. According to the Department of Labor, 67% of New York garment factories paid their workers less than the minimum wage and forced them to work long hours. Increasingly, workers who assert their right to collective bargaining are fired without cause or locked out of the workplace, just as they were in 1909 at Cooper Union. Currently, state legislatures are at the forefront of trying to disable labor unions and their collective bargaining rights to argue effectively with their employers.
In 2011, Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, eliminated public employee bargaining rights for pensions and benefits in an attempt to lower the state's debt.
Although Walker denied that he was cutting their wages, Section 7 of the NLRA defines pensions and benefits as wages. The public reaction was to target a recall.
The reaction of clear-seeing individuals in crafting worker safety and labor reform legislation makes the Triangle Fire the root of the most heartening revolution of the 20th century. "Is it a man or a woman?" a reporter asked.
"It's human," the policeman said.